in the series, which we'll be in probably for months to come through the Gospels, considering the questions of Jesus. He asked a lot of questions, over 300. Some of them are duplicates. Some of them are less than profound questions, but many of them have a lot of weight and implication for our lives. So we have to consider, why did he ask these questions? And most of them remain unanswered. They're rhetorical. So we really have to consider, what's he trying to say? What is Jesus trying to say to us by asking these questions? Today, the question is from Matthew 16:9. Do you still not understand? Or do you not yet perceive? Do you still not understand? So let's look at the context. Matthew 16, beginning in verse 1. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came. Okay, so we have to pause. It is very unusual to see the Pharisees and the Sadducees named side by side in the ancient Near East, in Judaism at least. These were two sects, S-E-C-T-S, like sectarian denominations. Let's call them denominations. These are two denominations of Judaism, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And we'll talk more about each of them in a moment, but I want you to understand they were at odds with one another. They weren't buddies. They weren't friends. They were often enemies in daily life, in religious life. And so they're named together, which as an audience, that should trigger us to think, okay, this is odd. Something about this is different. Then it goes on to say they came together with a common enemy. Any guesses who that would be? Yeah, Jesus of Nazareth. So they come to test Jesus, and they ask him to show another sign from heaven. So Jesus answers them. When it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. Then in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. So you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you can't interpret the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, yet no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. Then when the disciples reached the other side, and now we're talking about the Sea of Galilee, on the other side of the sea, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So they began discussing it among themselves, saying, oh man, we didn't bring any bread. Jesus, aware of this, said, oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you don't have bread? Do you not understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000? And how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I wasn't speaking about bread? So then he repeats it. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he wasn't talking about the leaven, he wasn't telling them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So this passage is a little interesting. It's implying that we know what already happened. If you don't, I'll refresh you very quickly. Jesus has spoken to a couple of different times now. He's spoken to crowds of thousands of hungry people, and he's been able to miraculously feed those people with many baskets of leftovers, 12 basketfuls as a sign of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's, some really neat imagery in there. But basically, he feeds thousands of people with just a small basket of food. And the implication is he can feed the masses because he is the bread of heaven. So we're supposed to have that in our minds already, and we're also supposed to be familiar with the Pharisees and the Sadducees by this point, that they are mutually enemies of Jesus, though exclusively very different in the way they see the world. Okay, so we can include them together as Jesus' enemies, but beyond that, they can't really be held together in any other way. They are very different. They are Jewish, and they don't like Jesus, and that's about all they have in common. So we need to consider these two groups because they're mentioned like 3 or 4 times in just this little passage of 12 verses. So it's important, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But another thing's mentioned, and that is leaven. Now, you know what leaven is, I'm sure. If not, it's just another word for yeast. And I'm sure you know what yeast is, right? Now, the ancient Near Eastern people did not have Fleischmann's, that's a weird word. Okay, there's debate. What is it? Flashman's? Fleshman's? Well, go ahead, debate it. I want to see people fight over this. I have no idea. Some Yiddish name from Eastern European Jewish families, probably. I don't know. I really don't care. You know what I'm talking about. It's a little packet of instant activated yeast, right? The point is they didn't have that. They didn't have grocery stores to go buy it. So they had Now, let me be clear. Sourdough starter is not technically yeast, right? It's a way to develop bacteria and whatever. But it's closer to that. So the only thing I could think of to resemble ancient yeast for bread was more like a sourdough starter. It's something that's held and continued to be used to develop that yeast so that it is a decomposing bacteria. Yeast is kind of nasty if you think about it. So don't think about it. Just like all the delicious cheese that I eat. I don't think about how they make that cheese. I just enjoy it. Most of the things I love involve fermentation and decay. There's got to be some deep meaning there. Anyway, that's yeast. So hopefully you know what yeast is. You put a little bit in a lump of dough and you leave it in a warm, humid place, put a towel over it. The next morning you hope that it hasn't blown the towel off because it'll blow up, right? It'll develop air pockets all in it. It'll activate the yeast and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We've had some of those moments where it got too big, and you have to beat the dough back down and hope that it's going to turn out okay. We've had times where the yeast didn't activate properly, and it didn't really rise much. And, everybody's had stories like that. You know what yeast is, right? Raise your hands if you're with me on yeast. Let's at least agree we know what that is. Okay. I don't want to spend more time on that. I'm afraid you don't know as much about Pharisees and Sadducees, so I'm going to spend a little more time on those people. The Pharisees are a school of Jewish teachers who are consumed with law-keeping. Before you vilify them and think these are the evil Jews, many of them are good, well-meaning Jewish men. They have formed rabbinical schools where they train one another in Mishnaic tradition, that is, the oral law. They hand it down and they teach it to one another, generation to generation. The Mishnah, the teachings in addition to Torah, which is the law in the first 5 books of the Bible, you would think of books like Leviticus, right? The Levitical law, the law of Moses. In addition to those laws, they have added all kinds of other commandments to help protect you. They said it was building a hedge of protection, not like when you pray for a hedge of protection on someone's trip to Florida and traveling mercies. This is more, I'm not belittling that. That's a polite thing to pray for. This is more of a hedge around the law. It's a fence to keep you inside the law of God. So if God says not to do this, we're going to build a fence back here so we don't even get close to the road, right? There's no chance we're going to run out in the road because we put a fence 100 feet before you ever get to the road. The problem is you have limited the freedoms that God had already given people. You've added to the commands of God. So the Pharisees did that for generations until they had hundreds of these extra rules. They did this to protect themselves from law breaking because the Pharisees were messianic people. They were waiting for the anointed king, the Messiah of God, to come and vindicate them, to rescue them. In the past, it was from the hand of the Medo-Persians or the Greek Empire. At the present, in the time of Jesus, it's the Romans who have occupied Jerusalem and taken over the city. They are waiting for a king to usurp the throne of Caesar, the emperor, and bring justice to God's chosen people, the Jews. So their intentions seem good, right? They are pro-Judaism, pro the God of Israel, pro the law of Moses. They support all these things. But by supporting these things, by nature, they have to oppose a lot of other things. So they become very narrow-minded, and often today we would call them bigoted people. They're uppity. That's the word I would use. They think they're better than everybody else. And for the most part, most of them seem to function that way. So Jesus has a big problem with their arrogance, their pride, that they are puffed up, that they say one thing but they do another. And so he uses the word hypocrite, which comes from a Greek word, and it means stage acting. They put on a face. They pretend. These are pretenders. They claim to care about righteousness and keeping the law of God, but they themselves hardly do any of the law of God. They might tithe 10% of their spice cabinet. He says, you give 10% of your mint and your dill and your cumin. Imagine not just your bank account, but you go in your cabinets and you dump out your spices every week, and you cut out 10% of your dill seed and you give it to the church. That's an exaggeration. But he's saying with hyperbole, you care about these tiny little minutia details of law, but you don't care about the weighty stuff like love, justice, mercy. You should have cared about those things. You could tithe, that's good, but you should have also cared about the bigger stuff. So that's the Pharisees in a nutshell. They're protecting the law because they're waiting for the Messiah to come. And they know until we keep the law of God, he won't send us the king that we need. Then you have the Sadducees. The Sadducees are politicized. So if the Pharisees are legalistic, the Sadducees are political. They are co-opted by Rome. They're in Rome's pocket, and they line Rome's pocket with their money, well, the money of their neighbors usually. They are extortioners. They are abusers of power. The Sadducees run the temple precinct. So if the Pharisees are the common folks' teachers, the Sadducees are the ones who hold political clout. They sit in the upper echelon of Jewish society. They are the rich and powerful among the Jews. They have political status. They have a good relationship with Caesar and his prefect or procurator in Judea, which we know at the time of Jesus is Pontius Pilate. So they work with him. They work with the Idumean king Herod. And Herod, in fact, in Mark's gospel, Jesus says Herod, not Sadducees. He says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. Because in the mind of Jesus, Herod and the Sadducees go hand in hand. It is the picture of compromised Jewish politics, that people will sacrifice their faith and values and love of their neighbor in order to secure more power and wealth and status. Now, with those explanations, you see why the Pharisees and the Sadducees have a problem with Jesus, a mutual distaste for Jesus, because on the one hand, he is breaking a lot of their commandments. That's what they keep accusing him of. You're doing work on the Sabbath, you're eating and picking grain and healing people and doing all this stuff. You're not even honoring the Sabbath. And Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. Who are you to tell me what I can do on the Sabbath? And they get mad that he's casting out demons. And they say, by what power? Oh, it must be by the prince of demons. Everything he does, they want to throw out that he's somehow undermining the law of Moses, that he thinks he's better than Moses. So they think Jesus is going to keep Messiah from coming, which is ironic, at least for us today, because we now know Jesus is who? He's Hamashiach. He's the Messiah that they're waiting for. They're blind to it. Thus why he calls them the blind guides leading the blind. Okay, so that's the Pharisees. Then you have the Sadducees. Jesus, although we don't often see him this way, is a political figure in the New Testament. His disciples are certainly political figures. They become revolutionaries, not through violent revolution, but nonviolent revolution. They go around saying, not Caesar is Lord, not Caesar, but Jesus is Lord. And soon enough, there's the development of an imperial cult where they worship the emperor as God, and Jesus' disciples refuse that and say, we will not bow the knee to a Roman emperor. We will pay taxes. Jesus told us, the face of Caesar's on the coin, give him the coin. Who cares about the coin? But whose image do you bear? And of course, the answer is God. And so Jesus teaches his friends, you can give the money back to Caesar, but you do not belong to the kingdom of this world. Caesar doesn't own you. So they bow the knee to Jesus and claim him as Lord. And this by itself is a huge political statement in the early church. So you have the Sadducees who are politically threatened by the revolutionary mindset of Jesus and his followers. And you have the Pharisees who feel legally threatened, that is religious law, so traditionally threatened in their religious practices, that Jesus is going to undo all the hard work that they've done for hundreds of years to protect the law of Moses. They both feel threatened, and seemingly for good reason from their perspective. And so Jesus treats them as enemies, but as enemies that he cares about. He pities them at times. He prays for them and offers them advice. He's not mean. He doesn't retaliate. It's as if he says, I know why you're doing these things. I just wish you could see how stupid it is. It's like the way we are with our small children at times. You know, I love you. That's why I'm telling you this is stupid. Don't do this. I see why you're doing it. I see why you think this is a good idea, but it's not. That's Jesus with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and without being very demeaning most of the time. Now, he is pretty harsh when he goes through the 7 woes, but we're not going to talk about that this morning. So that's the background of Pharisees and Sadducees. What I want you to notice is that a little yeast, given enough time, will leaven an entire lump, or raise up an entire lump. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, right? You just need a little bit worked in and give it time, and it will affect everything. The Pharisees' hypocrisy and legalism, just a little bit of it, has puffed them up to this very ungodly state where they look down on others, they don't know how to love their neighbors, they no longer practice justice or mercy. And Jesus says, what you thought was good, a little bit of trying to keep the law, has turned you into the antithesis of God's law. People without love and compassion and mercy. To the Sadducees, he would say, what you thought was good, which is to protect the temple and the sacred traditions of our people. And by the way, the Sadducees did not keep the oral traditions. They only held the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Pentateuch. And in those 5 books, they have some laws, but they have a lot of things that are not really spelled out, like angels and demons. A lot of that came hundreds of years later in Jewish writing. Some of it not even in our Bibles. And they didn't have any mention of literal resurrection, so they didn't believe in resurrection. There were a lot of things they did not believe in that the Pharisees did. So they were at odds in their doctrine. And yet, Jesus isn't concerned with fixing their doctrine. He's trying to tell them the way they live doesn't line up with what they profess. If you say you serve the God of Israel, then you should be like the God of Israel. The problem is that a little of what they did, for the Sadducees, a little of trying to protect the temple and maintain freedom, because that's their concern, is to be free to worship God, not to be overwhelmed by Roman occupation or any empire that comes in. Their desire to protect their faith and their people and keep them safe and pay off the pagan military, and the Pharisees' desire to protect the law and be faithful and true to God, those are good desires. But he says the way you've gone about it, you've let a little bit of pride or a little bit of power hunger turn you into something else. So what was good in its intention, like when you put a little yeast in a lump of dough, if you leave it for too long unchecked, it becomes something that it was never meant to be, almost untamable. And then you might have to start over. So Jesus comes in to clean up house. He's saying, you've let these things go on too long. The hypocrisy and legalism, the politicized, paganized, diluted message of God. There is no justice. All they care about is maintaining power and clout and status and money. All the Pharisees care about is maintaining their status among the people, that they are self-righteous and self-promoting. And he looks at all of this and he says, you intended to protect the law and keep the temple safe, and what you've done is broken the law of God, become lawless, and you have desecrated the temple of God and turned it from a house of prayer into a den of thieves and robbers. The very things you intended to protect, you have ruined. Now, do you see why they don't like him? So what about you? It's easy to talk about Pharisees and Sadducees 2,000 years ago. But there are a lot of Pharisees and Sadducees in our midst, sometimes looking back at us in a mirror. Are we not guilty of doing the same things? In order to be faithful to the law of God, we add our own rules and traditions and hold them up as if they are the commands of God. And if people break them, we begin to judge those people and see them as less than we are. That's Pharisaism. Or like the Sadducees, we want so badly to protect our Christian freedoms that we will compromise the very message we stand for in order to gain political clout, in order to maintain power in society. We're so concerned that the church affect American culture that we ironically give in to the whims of American culture and become less and less of the church. This is happening every day, all around us and among us. A little leaven, given enough time, will leaven the whole lump. So Jesus says, beware. Beware. Not get rid of all the leaven. Just be careful that it's not the wrong kind or given too much time to ferment or whatever. It's just be careful. The message isn't start over. The message isn't don't ever use leaven ever again. None of that would be realistic. He's just saying be careful. Be careful what you do, what little things you allow into your life, because they will have big and lasting influences and impact. Jesus, throughout Scripture, is called the bread of heaven, especially in John's gospel. He's the bread of heaven. That's good news. We think of the unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pesach, Passover, that they celebrate every year, even today among Jewish people. Now it's the Seder meal, but it was always a feast given to celebrate the freedom through the Exodus out of Egypt, that God passed over the firstborn children of Israel and then set them into freedom, into the land of the wilderness, and then eventually into the land of the promise, which we know today is modern-day Israel. All of that story bound up in this memorial feast every year when they gather at each other's homes and they break bread, unleavened bread. They've gotten rid of all the chametz, all the yeast in the house. For like a week beforehand, they have to clean out every little bit of yeast, sweep the floors, wipe the counters, wipe the windowsills. Every bit of yeast has to be removed because just a little bit could taint this good thing that God is trying to do. They had to get out of Egypt in a hurry to pursue freedom with God. That's the Exodus, right? And who leads the Exodus? Moses, the giver of the law. And so Jesus has taken the image that is so Jewish, and he's reframing it, saying, I am the new Moses. This is a new Exodus. He's also Joshua. His name literally is Joshua, Yeshua, which is the short form of Yehoshua. So he literally is named Joshua, who is Moses' successor, who not only leads them out of the Exodus with Moses, but then leads them into the land of promise by crossing the River Jordan, the very place Jesus is baptized in the Gospels, and then goes back into the city. So Jesus is the new Moses. He's the new Joshua. This is a new Exodus, a new land of promise. Everything is being made new, not being canceled or abolished, but fulfilled. All the hope of the Old Testament being fulfilled in Jesus. That's the picture. And he's saying if that's the picture, then the bread's going to be different too. It's also new. This is not the same manna from heaven. This is not the same unleavened bread that you've used for so long. I'm offering you something new, something different. The bread, and I think this is something Jesus wants us to notice, the bread has always been there, even if it's different now, even if he's doing something new or better. It's not like God ever stopped providing for his people. One of the problems the Pharisees and Sadducees had, one of the reasons I think they became over-leavened or overly fermented or whatever happened to them, whatever poisoned them, I think some of it was a fear that God wouldn't do what God said God would do. And so they thought they had to do it, whether it was by keeping the law so perfectly or by protecting themselves politically and making the right alliances. Whatever they did, I think they did out of fear, which fear is, of course, a lack of faith and trust. And so Jesus comes in and says, if I'm here to offer bread, and I'm always going to be here to offer it, then you don't need to be afraid anymore, and you don't have to do what they did. You don't have to be like them. But overcoming that fear is hard. Believing that God has always been waiting there to bless and provide is sometimes hard. But Jesus reminds us that the blessing isn't cheap. Elsewhere in the Bible, he's called the bread of affliction. The bread of affliction. That he will eat the bread of affliction. That we have to share in the bread of affliction. And by that we mean self-denial and self-sacrifice, self-giving love. The very thing that makes Jesus uniquely different than most of those Pharisees and Sadducees is that he understands the nature of God is self-giving love, not keeping commandments and maintaining political power. It's giving it yourself away. It is more blessed to give than to receive. He's trying to teach us that if we could remove the hypocrisy, the self-promotion, the self-aggrandizing, the self-righteousness, everything about us, if we could get rid of us and care more about God and others, which of course he sums up the law by saying love God and love your neighbor. If we could do that better, then we would get rid of this leaven. It's not like some easy one-step process to just get rid of the leaven. And that's what's tricky about leaven. It's essentially invisible, and it does its work in secret, inside of you. Yeast is an amazing thing. Perhaps that's why God chose it as the image here, that it's a little thing somewhere inside of you don't even see. Carl Jung would call it the unconscious, right? That it controls, I think Carl Jung said like 90% of what we do is probably controlled by our unconscious thoughts. That's crazy. I don't know if that's exactly right, but modern psychology tells us more and more that the unconscious, the subconscious, is doing things we don't even understand all the time. Perhaps Jesus was trying to tell his friends, you can't do this yourself. You can't just fix it. Once the leaven's in there, you can't get that out. Only God can do this. It will take inner transformation. Something inside of you has to be changed beyond your control. He's inviting the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of his own disciples to be transformed. And so today he invites you into transformation, that the leaven might be removed from your life. The self-sacrifice, that self-sacrifice would replace it. If we don't discover a faith, a belief, a prayer practice, a way of living for Jesus that transforms the inner person, then we will change very little over an entire lifetime. You know people like this, don't you? The Pharisees and Sadducees of the church today who week after week attend services and go to church, and yet by the time they're older people have very little to say for their faith. They haven't done much. They haven't changed much. They haven't been transformed because they haven't exchanged the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees for the healthy yeast of the gospel. And that is a tricky thing that Jesus uses it in a good way and a bad way. But Paul says that too, right? 1 Corinthians, he says, a little leaven will leaven the whole lump. You should have removed that man. In 1 Corinthians 5, should have removed him from the church before he poisoned the whole church. But elsewhere, we're told if we have the grace of Jesus, just a little bit goes a long way. A little leaven could leaven the whole lump. So it works both ways. A little of the bad thing can become a big bad thing, but a little of the right stuff can make a lot of things right. So if we would exchange selfish, self-promoting ideals as Christians out of fear, trying to protect ourselves and prove how good we are, if we would get rid of that fear and instead accept the grace of Jesus and trust him and let God do his work freely in our lives, if we would be humble and learn to love God and love our neighbor and do the simple gospel work of Jesus, then that little bit of leaven could do miraculous things in our lives. The metaphor of leaven is about inner transformation. So our prayer can't be too rational. Our faith cannot be too rational, social, verbal, linear, transactional. I could preach a whole sermon on that word, transactional Christianity. So much of my childhood faith was transactional. I give you this, you give me that. I put in the prayer money, I punch the button, you give me what I ask for. If not, I shake and kick the machine, and I say, maybe I need a different machine. Whether that's a different God, a different denomination, whatever, until I get what I want, because I gave what I thought I should give to get what I want. All of that transactional. Or, God forbid, you think God is like that with you until you give him what he wants, then he'll finally give you salvation or something like that. All of that is so underdeveloped, and it's impoverished, it's poor faith, it's weak, feeble faith. And Jesus says, if you would take the leaven of self-denial, the simple love of God and love of neighbor, and let that infect your life, it would create something beautiful. It would develop you. It would grow you in healthy ways. So our faith and our prayer has to be more mysterious. It has to be an inner life that changes, dialogical, receptive, pervasive. So when I read the story again, I can't help but notice that Jesus asks his friends, do you still not get it? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember? Do you not understand? Do you not remember? And I've always read it like Jesus being really frustrated, the way I would be very frustrated with my friends and say, don't you get it? How can you be so stupid? And maybe that is how he meant it. But to wrap up this morning, I want to say one more thing. Kylie asked me this week, she goes, what if he didn't say it like that? I said, what do you mean? She goes, what if he said, do you still not get it? Let me show you again. And then, of course, he had just talked about the sign of Jonah. The only sign you're going to get, the only thing that's really going to show you is when I'm in the belly of the earth, when I die and am buried for you. Then when I rise again, you'll finally get it. Jesus doesn't say, do you not understand, out of frustration, out of anger. He says it out of long-suffering love. Do you still not see? Let me show you. So I want to end with the final words of Psalm 139. It's the first prayer that came to my mind in Scripture that has to do with self-reflection, with inner transformation. Basically, with letting God remove the bad yeast and put the good stuff in its place. And this is what the prayer of the psalmist says. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any grievous way in me. I'm going to substitute that. See if there be any unhealthy leaven in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This we pray in the powerful name of Jesus, your Son. Help us to remember and help us to understand.